The clock on the wall showed 8:47 p.m. when David heard the desperate knocking on his clinic door. He'd been a veterinarian for nearly 20 years, and he knew that sound. It was the kind of frantic banging that meant someone needed help, and they needed it right now. David put down the medical chart he was updating and walked toward the front entrance. Through the glass door, he could see an elderly woman standing in the dim parking lot light. She was hunched over, holding something large against her chest. Her gray hair was loose and wild around her face, and even from a distance he could tell something was terribly wrong. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that seemed to carry years of pain. Her face was thin, too thin, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. She was clutching a burlap sack, the kind farmers used to use for potatoes or grain. The sack looked heavy and her arms were shaking from the effort of holding it. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need help. I couldn't do it myself anymore." David stepped aside to let her in. The November wind was bitter cold, and the woman wasn't dressed warmly enough. She wore only a long, oversized coat that looked decades old, and thin shoes that had seen better days. "Come inside, it's freezing out there," David said gently. He guided her through the waiting room and into one of the examination rooms. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she shuffled in slowly, still clutching that mysterious sack. The woman sat down heavily in the chair meant for pet owners, and David noticed how she winced as she moved. There was something about the way she held herself carefully, as if every movement caused pain. "What's your name?" David asked, pulling up a stool to sit at her level. "Maggie," she said quietly. "Maggie Sullivan. I live out on Riverside Road, the old yellow house past the bridge." David nodded. He knew the area. It was rural, isolated. The houses out there sat on large plots of land, far apart from each other. "What brings you here tonight, Maggie? Is there an animal that needs help?" She shook her head, and tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her whole body started trembling, and the sack in her lap shook with her. "Please," she said again, her voice barely audible. "Please, take them off." David felt confused. "Take what off?" "Maggie, I'm not sure I understand." She pushed the burlap sack toward him across the examination table. The movement seemed to take all her strength. "Inside," she managed to say. "Look inside. I need them off. I can't live like this anymore. 23 years. 23 years I've carried this." David's mind raced through possibilities. Was there an injured animal in the sack? Some kind of medical equipment? He reached for the sack carefully, noting how heavy it felt. Whatever was inside had real weight to it. "It's okay," he said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Maggie turned her face away, unable to watch. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have done this years ago. I was so ashamed." David loosened the rope that tied the top of the sack closed. The rough burlap felt old and worn under his fingers. He pulled the opening wide and looked inside. For a moment, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. The sack was filled with padlocks. Dozens of them. Old, rusty padlocks of various sizes, all tangled together in a heap. Some were small, the kind you might use on a locker. Others were larger, heavy-duty locks that looked like they belonged on a warehouse door. But that wasn't what made David's breath catch in his throat. Attached to each lock, tied with faded ribbons or thin strips of cloth, were small pieces of paper. He picked up one of the locks and saw handwriting on the paper. A date. March 15th, 2003. "I saw a butterfly today." Another lock had a different note. September 22nd, 2008. The rain sounded like music. "Maggie," David said slowly, still staring at the contents of the sack. "What are these?" She finally looked at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "They're mine," she said. "Every single one. They've been on me, around me, for 23 years. David felt his stomach drop. "On you? I don't understand." With shaking hands, Maggie began unbuttoning her oversized coat. David instinctively started to tell her she didn't need to do that, but something in her expression stopped him. She needed him to see. She needed him to understand. As the coat fell open, David saw what she meant. Underneath her loose clothing, wrapped around her torso, were thick chains. Heavy metal chains that circled her body multiple times, hidden all these years beneath baggy shirts and that enormous coat. The chains were secured with those very padlocks, the ones now sitting in the sack between them. Dear God, David breathed. Maggie's whole body was shaking now, whether from cold or relief or fear he couldn't tell. My husband, she said, her voice distant as if she was speaking from somewhere far away. He put them on me. 23 years ago, he said. He said I couldn't be trusted. He said I would leave him, that I was hiding things from him. He wasn't well. In his mind, this made sense. David stood up, his medical training kicking in even as his mind reeled from what he was hearing. Maggie, we need to get you to a hospital right now. He died, she continued as if she hadn't heard him. 3 days after he locked them on. Heart attack, sudden. He never told me where he put the keys. I looked everywhere in that house, everywhere, but I never found them. Why didn't you? David stopped himself. He knew why. He could see it in her face. The shame, the fear, the trauma. Maggie, you've been living like this for over 2 decades? She nodded slowly. I taught myself to manage. I learned to live with the pain. I wore big clothes. I stopped seeing people. I couldn't let anyone know. What would they think? That I was crazy? That I let this happen? I survived. Day by day. Those notes you see on the locks, those were the moments I chose to keep living. Little things that reminded me life was still worth it, even like this. David pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking now too. I'm calling for help. We're going to get those chains off you tonight. You understand me? Tonight. This ends tonight. Maggie closed her eyes, and for the first time in what looked like years, her face softened. Thank you, she whispered. I was so scared to come here, so scared. But I couldn't do another day. I just couldn't. As David dialed emergency services, he looked at this elderly woman who had suffered in silence for so long, and he felt something break in his chest. How many people pass by suffering every day and never know it? How many secrets are carried behind closed doors? The dispatcher answered, and David explained the situation as calmly as he could. They would send an ambulance and a police officer. Medical attention was critical. While they waited, David grabbed a blanket from his supply closet and wrapped it around Maggie's shoulders. She looked so small, so fragile, yet she had carried this unbearable weight for more than 2 decades. You're very brave, David told her. Maggie shook her head. I'm not brave. Brave would have been getting help 20 years ago. No, David said firmly. Brave is asking for help at all. Brave is deciding that today is the day things change. That's what you did. That's courage. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, its red and blue lights painting the parking lot in urgent colors. 2 paramedics rushed in with their equipment, followed closely by a young police officer named Rachel Torres. Officer Torres had been with the local department for only 3 years, but she'd already developed a reputation for being thorough and compassionate. David quickly explained what Maggie had told him. The paramedics, a man named Tom and a woman named Lisa, listened with growing concern. They'd seen a lot in their years of emergency response, but this was something entirely new. Ma'am, we're going to take a look, okay? Lisa said gently, kneeling beside Maggie's chair. We need to see what we're dealing with so we can get you the right help. Maggie nodded weakly. She looked exhausted, as if finally telling her secret had drained every last bit of energy from her body. Lisa carefully helped her remove the coat completely, revealing the full extent of the chains underneath. Tom let out a low whistle, then immediately apologized. Sorry, ma'am. We need to get you to the hospital right away. These chains, they look like they've been on for a long time. We need surgeons to remove them safely. Officer Torres stepped forward, her notepad in hand, but her expression was one of shock and sympathy rather than professional detachment. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you some questions, but they can wait until you're being treated. Your health comes first. I'll tell you everything, Maggie said quietly. I have nothing left to hide now. As the paramedics prepared Maggie for transport, David couldn't stop staring at the chains visible beneath her thin shirt. They were thick industrial chains, the kind used for heavy machinery or securing cargo. They'd wrapped around her body at least 4 or 5 times, creating layers of metal that must have weighed 30 or 40 pounds. Maybe more. The locks hung at various points, keeping the chains impossibly tight. Over the years, the metal had worn grooves into the fabric of her clothing. David noticed rust stains and darker marks that might have been blood. How did you... Tom started to ask, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he focused on taking Maggie's vital signs. Your blood pressure is low. When's the last time you ate? Yesterday morning, Maggie admitted. Some toast. It's hard to eat much. The chains press on my stomach. Lisa exchanged a worried glance with Tom. We're getting you fluids right away. Your body is under tremendous stress. They started an IV line and carefully helped Maggie onto the stretcher. Every movement made her wince, and David could see how the chains shifted beneath her clothes, pulling against skin that had surely developed sores and wounds. I'm coming with you, David announced. He looked at Officer Torres.
Is that all right?
Of course, Rachel said. Mrs. Sullivan needs all the support she can get. I'll follow in my patrol car and meet you at the hospital. As they wheeled Maggie out to the ambulance, she reached out and grabbed David's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Don't leave me, she pleaded. Please, I don't have anyone else. I'm not going anywhere, David promised. He climbed into the ambulance beside her and the doors closed behind them. The ride to Regional Medical Center took 20 minutes. The ambulance's siren wailed through the quiet night, announcing an emergency that no one on the streets could have imagined. Inside, Tom and Lisa worked efficiently, monitoring Maggie's vital signs and radioing ahead to the emergency room. We're bringing in a 68-year-old female with chains wrapped around her torso. Lisa spoke into her radio. They've been in place for approximately 23 years. Patient is showing signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and possible infection. We'll need surgical consultation immediately. The voice on the other end crackled back with acknowledgement, though David could hear the confusion in the dispatcher's response. This wasn't something you encountered in medical school. Maggie drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride. When she was awake, she kept talking in fragments, as if pieces of her story were breaking free after being locked away for so long. He wasn't always like that, she murmured at one point. Robert, my husband, when we first married, he was kind, gentle, but something changed in his mind. He started believing things that weren't true. He thought everyone was against him, that I was against him. David held her hand and listened. Sometimes that's all you can do for someone. Just listen while they finally speak their truth. I tried to get him help, Maggie continued, her eyes staring at the ceiling of the ambulance. I called doctors. I talked to his brother. But back then, in a small town, people didn't like to admit when something was wrong. Mental illness was shameful. So we all pretended everything was fine, until it wasn't. What happened the day he put the chains on you? David asked gently. Maggie's eyes filled with tears again. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been planning to go to the library that day. I loved the library. Robert came home from work early. He had this wild look in his eyes, and he was carrying these chains. He'd bought them from the hardware store. He told me he'd figured it out. He knew I was planning to leave him, to take all our money and disappear. None of it was true, but in his mind it was real. She paused, struggling with the memory. Lisa squeezed her other hand encouragingly. He told me the chains would keep me safe. Keep us together. He said if I really loved him, I'd understand. I tried to run, but he was stronger than me. He wrapped the chains around me, clicked those locks shut, and then he just sat down and cried. He cried for hours, saying he was sorry, but it had to be done. The ambulance hit a bump, and Maggie gasped in pain. Tom adjusted her position slightly, trying to make her more comfortable. But there was only so much they could do while the chains were still on. 3 days later, he had the heart attack, Maggie said. He was only 52. It happened in the backyard. He was pruning the rose bushes, and he just collapsed. I called 911, but it was too late. He died before the ambulance arrived, and the keys to the locks died with him. You looked for them? David asked. For months, Maggie said. I tore that house apart. I checked every drawer, every pocket of every piece of clothing, every box in the attic and basement. I thought maybe he'd hidden them somewhere obvious, somewhere I'd find them easily once I needed them. But I never did. Eventually, I realized he might have thrown them away, or hidden them somewhere I'd never think to look. Or maybe he didn't even remember where he put them. The ambulance pulled into the hospital's emergency bay. The back doors flew open, and a team of doctors and nurses stood ready. David climbed out first, then stayed close as they wheeled Maggie inside. The emergency room exploded into controlled chaos. Dr. Patricia Wheeler, the lead emergency physician on duty, took one look at Maggie and immediately called for backup. Within minutes, a surgeon named Dr. James Park was rushing down from the operating floor. Still in his scrubs from a previous procedure, they moved Maggie into a trauma bay, and Dr. Wheeler carefully cut away her shirt to fully assess the situation. The room fell silent as the full extent of the chains became visible. They'd wrapped around her torso so many times that they covered her from just below her chest to her hips. The metal had pressed into her skin for so long that in some places it had created deep grooves. There were wounds, some fresh and some old, where the chains had rubbed constantly against her body. "My God," Dr. Park whispered. Then louder, to his team, "We need to get her to surgery now. These chains have been compressing her organs for years. We need x-rays first to see what we're dealing with. Then we need to remove them as carefully as possible." Nurse Jennifer Rodriguez, who'd been working in emergency medicine for 15 years, had to blink back tears as she helped prepare Maggie for x-rays. "You're safe now," she told the elderly woman. "We're going to take care of you." Officer Torres arrived just as they were wheeling Maggie toward radiology. She caught up with David in the hallway. "How is she?" "They're going to remove the chains surgically," David said. He felt drained, as if he'd lived through years in just the past hour. "The doctors say it's going to be complicated. The chains have been on so long that her body has adapted around them." Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "I've been a police officer for 3 years. I've seen domestic situations, bad ones, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." "And she lived like this for 23 years? How is that even possible?" "People can endure incredible things when they have no other choice," David said quietly. "And shame is a powerful prison. She was too afraid to ask for help." "I need to write up a report," Rachel said. "Even though the husband is deceased, there needs to be a record of what happened. And I want to look into his background, see if there were any prior incidents reported." The x-rays revealed what everyone feared but hoped wouldn't be true. The chains hadn't just rested on Maggie's skin for 23 years. In several places, they'd actually begun to embed themselves into her tissue. Her body, trying to heal around a wound that never stopped being inflicted, had grown scar tissue that partially enclosed the metal links. Dr. Park studied the images with a grim expression. "This is going to require multiple surgeries," he told his team. "We can't just cut the chains off. We need to carefully separate the metal from her tissue without causing more damage. Some of these areas are dangerously close to vital organs." The first surgery began at midnight. David waited in the surgical waiting room, unable to go home. He'd called his assistant to open the clinic in the morning and reschedule his appointments. Something about Maggie's story had grabbed hold of him and wouldn't let go. Officer Torres sat with him for a while, typing notes into her laptop. "I did some preliminary research," she said after a long silence. "Robert Sullivan, Maggie's late husband. I pulled up some old records." David looked up. "What did you find?" "There were 3 calls to the house over the years before he died," Rachel said. "Neighbors reported hearing yelling, sounds of things breaking. Each time officers went out there. Each time both Robert and Maggie told them everything was fine. Just arguments, nothing serious. The officers filed reports and left. No one pushed it further?" David asked. Rachel sighed. "Different era, different understanding of domestic situations. And honestly, if both parties say nothing's wrong and there's no visible evidence of harm, there's only so much the police can do. But looking back now, those were red flags. Someone should have followed up more carefully." They sat in silence for a moment, both thinking about how many opportunities had been missed to help Maggie before things got so desperate. "I talked to some of the older officers at the station," Rachel continued. "A couple of them remember Robert Sullivan. They said he was paranoid, possibly mentally ill. But in those days, unless someone was an immediate danger to themselves or others, getting them involuntary treatment was nearly impossible. The system failed both of them. The surgery lasted 6 hours. When Dr. Park finally emerged, still in his surgical gown, he looked exhausted but relieved. "We got the chains off," he announced. "All of them. The padlocks too. It was delicate work, but we managed to remove everything without causing significant additional damage." David felt tears of relief prick his eyes. "How is she?" "Stable," Dr. Park said. "She's lost a lot of blood over the years from the constant wounds, which explains the malnutrition and weakness. Her internal organs were compressed, but they seem to be functioning. The human body is remarkably resilient. She'll need weeks, maybe months of recovery, physical therapy, wound care, probably more surgeries to repair some of the damage. But she's going to survive. Can I see her?" David asked. She's in recovery now. Give it a few hours, then yes. I think she'd want to see a friendly face when she wakes up. As Dr. Park walked away, Rachel turned to David. You barely know this woman. Why are you still here? David thought about that. Because she came to me for help. Because I was the one she trusted when she had no one else. I can't just walk away from that. When Maggie finally woke up late the next morning, the first thing she noticed was the absence of weight. For 23 years, she'd carried those chains every moment of every day. Their removal felt like floating, like being untethered from the earth itself. David was sitting in a chair beside her hospital bed, dozing. The sound of her stirring woke him. Hey, he said softly. You're awake. How do you feel? Maggie tried to speak, but her throat was dry from the breathing tube. David helped her take small sips of water. Finally, she managed to whisper, They're gone? They're gone, David confirmed. All of them. The chains, the locks, everything. Dr. Park and his team removed them all. Fresh tears rolled down Maggie's cheeks, but these were different from the ones she'd cried in his clinic. These were tears of relief, of release, of a burden finally lifted. She raised a shaky hand to her chest, touching the bandages that now covered the wounds where the chains had been. I can breathe, she said in wonder. I can actually breathe deeply. I haven't been able to do that in so long. A nurse came in to check her vital signs, and behind her, Officer Torres appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Sullivan, Rachel said gently, I know you're recovering, but when you feel up to it, I'd like to hear your story. Everything you remember. It'll help me complete the official report. Maggie nodded. I'll tell you everything. It's time people knew. Over the next few hours, as she rested between examinations and treatments, Maggie began to piece together her story for Officer Torres. David listened quietly, and what emerged was a portrait of a slow descent into a nightmare. Robert Sullivan had been a mechanic, well-liked in the community. But according to Maggie, his personality changed gradually in his late 40s. He became suspicious, accusatory. He started believing that people were plotting against him. He thought Maggie was having affairs, though she never had. He became convinced she was stealing money from their joint account, though all the money was accounted for. I researched it at the library, Maggie said. I think he had some kind of mental illness that developed later in life. Maybe paranoid schizophrenia or some kind of delusional disorder, but he refused to see a doctor. He said doctors were part of the conspiracy against him. The day he'd brought home the chains was the culmination of months of deteriorating mental health. He'd told Maggie that he'd figured out her escape plan, that she was going to leave him that very week. He'd worked himself into a state of panic and believed that physically restraining her was the only solution. Did you ever try to cut the chains off yourself? Rachel asked. Maggie nodded. Many times in the first few years. I tried bolt cutters from the hardware store, but the chains were too thick and I couldn't get enough leverage. I tried a hacksaw, but the angle was wrong and I couldn't reach most of the chains. I even called a locksmith once, but when he asked what the locks were for, I panicked and hung up. You were afraid of judgment, David said. I was terrified, Maggie admitted. What would people think? That I'd let my husband do this to me? That I'd lived like this for years and never told anyone? I was ashamed. And as time went on, it got harder to speak up. How do you explain something like this? The longer I waited, the more impossible it seemed to ever tell the truth. Rachel closed her notebook. Mrs. Sullivan, what happened to you was not your fault. Your husband was clearly suffering from severe mental illness and he hurt you. That's abuse, plain and simple. The fact that you survived this long, that you kept going day after day, that's remarkable. Maggie shook her head. I didn't feel remarkable. I felt like a coward. Those notes you saw on the locks, those little scraps of paper, those were my reasons to live. On the worst days, when the pain was unbearable and I thought about ending it all, I would write down one small good thing. A butterfly, the sound of rain, a robin's song, a sunrise. I told myself that if I could find one small beautiful thing each day, I could survive one more day. David thought about those locks, now sitting in an evidence bag at the police station. Each one a testament to Maggie's will to survive. Over 23 years, she'd created hundreds of those little notes. Hundreds of reasons to keep living when her life seemed unlivable. A social worker named Patricia Williams came by later that afternoon. She sat with Maggie and gently asked questions about her living situation, her finances, her support system. The answers painted a picture of profound isolation. Maggie had no children. Her parents were long deceased. Robert's family had blamed her for his death and cut off contact years ago. She'd been a school teacher before Robert's paranoia made him insist she quit her job. She lived on his small pension and Social Security, barely enough to get by. "I stopped seeing friends after he died," Maggie explained. "I couldn't let anyone get close enough to discover the chains. I made excuses. Too tired, too busy. Eventually, people stopped calling. I became invisible." "You're not invisible anymore," Patricia said firmly. "We're going to make sure you have support. Medical care, counseling, help with your home if you need it. You're not going through this alone." That night, David went home to his small apartment and sat in the dark, thinking. He'd been divorced for 2 years, and lately he'd been feeling sorry for himself. His ex-wife had left him because he worked too much, cared too much about his patients, wasn't present enough in their marriage. He'd been wallowing in that failure. Meeting Maggie put everything in perspective. His problems seemed insignificant compared to what she'd endured. And yet she'd survived. Not just survived, she'd kept her humanity intact. Those notes on the locks proved that even in her darkest moments, she could still see beauty in the world. He thought about the burlap sack still sitting in his clinic, filled with those heavy padlocks. Maggie had asked him to take them, to get rid of them. But now he wondered if they should be kept, transformed into something meaningful. A reminder that suffering can end. That asking for help, even after decades of silence, is always worth it. David pulled out his phone and sent a text to a friend of his, Michael Chen, who was a metal worker and sculptor. "I have a project idea for you. Are you..." News travels fast in small towns, and by the end of the week, nearly everyone in the county had heard about Maggie Sullivan's ordeal. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with a respectful headline, "Local woman's 23-year ordeal ends with courageous plea for help." The reporter who wrote it, Catherine Mills, had been careful to focus on Maggie's survival and strength, rather than sensationalizing her suffering. David's clinic became an unexpected gathering point for people who wanted to help. Former students of Maggie's from her teaching days, now middle-aged themselves, stopped by to leave cards and flowers. Neighbors who'd noticed her isolation over the years came forward with guilt and concern. "We should have checked on her more," one woman said tearfully. "We just thought she wanted to be left alone." The hospital room filled with flowers and get-well cards. Maggie seemed overwhelmed by the attention. For so long she'd been invisible, and now suddenly everyone wanted to help. "I don't deserve this," she told David during one of his daily visits. "That's exactly why you deserve it," he replied. "You spent over 20 years thinking you didn't deserve help. You do. Everyone does." Dr. Park stopped by to check on her progress. The wounds where the chains had been were healing, though slowly. "You'll have scars," he told her honestly, "but they'll fade with time. The physical therapy is going to be crucial. Your muscles have atrophied from not being able to move freely for so long. We need to rebuild your strength." A physical therapist named Lynn Carter began working with Maggie daily. Simple movements that most people took for granted, like bending at the waist or raising her arms above her head, were difficult for Maggie at first. The chains had restricted her movement for so long that her body had forgotten how to move freely. "Don't push too hard," Lynn cautioned during their first session. "We're retraining your body. It takes time." But Maggie was determined. For the first time in decades, she had hope. Every small victory, standing up without pain, taking a deep breath that filled her entire lungs, wearing clothes that actually fit her body, felt like a miracle. The psychological recovery was harder than the physical healing. A trauma counselor, Dr. Helen Foster, began visiting Maggie twice a week. These sessions were difficult. Years of suppressed emotions came flooding out. Grief for the years lost, anger at Robert for what he'd done, mixed with lingering love for the man he'd been before illness changed him. Shame that she hadn't sought help sooner. "You survived," Dr. Foster reminded her repeatedly. "In impossible circumstances, you chose life over and over again. That's not weakness. That's incredible strength." During one session, Maggie broke down completely. "I could have left," she sobbed. "After he died, I could have gone to the hospital immediately. I could have told someone what happened. But I didn't. I made the choice to live like that for all those years. How can I forgive myself for that?" Dr. Foster leaned forward. "Trauma doesn't make logical sense from the outside. You were living with complex PTSD, severe anxiety, depression. Your mind was protecting you in the only way it knew how. by maintaining the status quo because change felt more terrifying than continued suffering. That's not a choice made with free will. That's a choice made from a place of deep psychological damage. Officer Torres continued her investigation, not because charges could be filed against a dead man, but because the full story needed to be documented. She interviewed Robert's former co-workers, and a picture emerged of a man whose mental health had clearly deteriorated in his final years. He talked about conspiracies, one retired mechanic told Rachel. He thought the government was spying on him through his TV. He thought his neighbors were plotting to steal his property. We all just thought he was eccentric, maybe a little paranoid. None of us imagined it was this severe. Rachel also discovered that Robert's brother, who lived 2 states away, had tried to get Robert evaluated by a mental health professional about a year before his death. Robert had refused, and without his cooperation, there was nothing the brother could do. I blame myself, the brother, Donald Sullivan told Rachel over the phone. I should have pushed harder. I should have done something more. The system makes it very difficult to help someone who doesn't want help, Rachel said, especially back then. We've learned a lot about mental health intervention in the past 2 decades, but we still have a long way to go. 2 weeks after Maggie's surgery, David met with Michael, the metal worker, at his studio on the edge of town. David brought the sack of padlocks and a few links of the chains that the hospital had saved. This is heavy stuff, Michael said, examining the locks. He read a few of the notes tied to them. These are powerful. She wrote these. One for each day she found a reason to keep living, David explained. I was thinking, what if we turn these into something beautiful? Something that represents freedom and hope instead of captivity and pain? Michael was quiet for a moment, turning a lock over in his hands. I have an idea. What if we create a sculpture? We could melt down some of the chains and cast them into the shape of birds taking flight. But we keep the locks intact, displayed in a way that people can read the notes if they want. It would be a testament to how she survived, David smiled. That's perfect. Do you think the town would want to display it somewhere public? Are you kidding? After what she went through, people would line up to make that happen. The proposal went to the town council and the vote was unanimous. The sculpture would be installed in the small park in the center of town, right near the historic district. They decided to call it Breaking Chains, a memorial to survival. When David told Maggie about the sculpture, he worried she might feel violated, like her private suffering was being made too public. But instead, her eyes lit up. Other people who are suffering need to know they can speak up, she said. If my story can help even one person find the courage to ask for help sooner than I did, then maybe all those years weren't completely wasted. The local news picked up the story, and it spread beyond their small town. A regional television station asked if they could interview Maggie. She hesitated at first, but Dr. Foster encouraged her to see it as part of her healing process, taking ownership of her story. The interview aired on a Friday evening. Maggie sat in a chair in the hospital's garden, the autumn leaves falling around her, and told her story to the reporter with calm dignity. She didn't shy away from the hard parts. She talked about the mental illness that had consumed her husband. She talked about the shame that had kept her silent. She talked about the daily choice to survive. What would you say to someone else who's suffering in silence? The reporter asked. Maggie looked directly into the camera. Tell someone. It doesn't matter how long it's been, how impossible it seems, how ashamed you feel. Tell someone. There are people who will help you. I lived in chains for 23 years because I was too afraid to ask for help. Don't make my mistake. Ask today. Ask right now. You deserve to be free. The interview went viral on social media. Within days, it had been viewed millions of times. David's clinic started receiving calls from across the country, people asking how they could support Maggie or share their own stories of hidden suffering. A domestic violence organization in the state capital reached out to Maggie through the hospital. They wanted to know if she'd be willing to speak at their annual conference. Survivors helping survivors, the director explained. Your story could inspire others. Maggie agreed, though the conference was still months away. She'd need to be much stronger by then, physically and emotionally, but having a goal to work toward gave her even more motivation during her recovery. Meanwhile, the community rallied to help in practical ways. A group of volunteers, organized by one of Maggie's former students, spent a weekend cleaning and repairing her long-neglected house. They painted walls, fixed the leaky roof, replaced broken windows, and cleared out years of accumulated clutter. "We should have been doing this all along," one volunteer said. "She was our teacher. She taught us how to read, how to think, and we forgot about her when she needed us." David's ex-wife, Jennifer, called him after seeing the news interview. "That woman you've been helping," she said. "What you're doing for her, that's the David I fell in love with. The one who cares so deeply about others." They talked for over an hour, really talked, for the first time since the divorce. Jennifer explained that she'd been in therapy, working through her own issues with communication and expectations. David admitted that he'd buried himself in work to avoid dealing with their marital problems. "I'm not suggesting we get back together," Jennifer said carefully, "but maybe we could be friends again. Real friends, not just polite strangers." "I'd like that," David said. And he meant it. Maggie's situation had taught him something important about human connection. It's never too late to reach out, to rebuild, to try again. The sculpture took shape over several weeks. Michael worked with painstaking care, transforming the instruments of Maggie's captivity into art. The base was made from the melted-down chains, formed into a circular platform. Rising from it were dozens of birds cast in bronze, their wings spread in flight. Each bird was slightly different, representing individuality and freedom. The padlocks were mounted on clear pedestals around the sculpture, arranged so visitors could walk around and read the December morning dawned clear and cold. By 10 o'clock, over 300 people had gathered in the town square for the sculpture unveiling. Local officials were there, along with reporters from several regional newspapers and TV stations. But mostly it was regular people from the community, drawn by curiosity and compassion in equal measure. David pushed Maggie's wheelchair to the front of the crowd. She wore a simple blue dress that one of her former students had bought for her, and a warm coat to protect against the winter chill. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine was straight and her head was high. The mayor, a kind woman named Linda Chen, stepped up to the microphone. "We're here today to witness something extraordinary," she began. "This sculpture represents one woman's incredible journey from captivity to freedom. But it represents something more than that. It represents our community's commitment to seeing each other, really seeing each other, to noticing when someone is suffering, to offering help before it's asked for." The crowd was silent, listening intently. Maggie Sullivan lived among us for decades, and she suffered in silence. That's partly her story, but it's also our story. We all shared this town, walked these streets, lived our lives alongside someone who was in desperate need, and we didn't see it. Today we commit to doing better, to paying attention, to caring for each other. Linda gestured toward the covered sculpture. "Maggie, would you like to say a few words before we unveil the memorial?" David wheeled Maggie closer to the microphone. She'd written notes for this speech, but as she looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom she recognized from her teaching days, she set the papers aside. "I was a teacher for 15 years, she began, her voice wavering slightly but growing stronger. "I taught 3rd grade. Reading, writing, arithmetic. But what I really tried to teach was kindness, empathy, the importance of helping others. And then when I needed help myself, I forgot all those lessons. I let shame and fear silence me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My husband Robert was sick. I don't say that to excuse what he did to me, but to explain it. His mind turned against him and he couldn't see reality anymore. In his illness, he hurt me terribly. After he died, I hurt myself by choosing silence over truth. That was my choice, my mistake, and I paid for it for 23 years. Some people in the crowd were openly crying now. But I'm here today to tell you that it's never too late to speak up. It's never too late to ask for help. I thought I'd waited too long, that my situation was too bizarre, too shameful to reveal, but I was wrong. When I finally found the courage to walk into that veterinary clinic and ask for help, I discovered something wonderful. People are good. People want to help. This community showed me more compassion than I'd shown myself." Maggie looked at David, who stood beside her wheelchair. Dr. David Chen could have turned me away that night. It was late, he was tired, I wasn't even there about an animal. But he listened. He helped. He stayed with me through the surgery, through the recovery. He became my friend when I had none. That's the kind of person we should all strive to be. She turned back to the crowd. This sculpture isn't really about me. It's about all of us. It's about the moments we choose to live, even when life is unbearably hard. It's about the small beauties that keep us going. And it's about community, about what we can be for each other when we pay attention. Linda stepped forward and pulled the covering off the sculpture. The crowd gasped collectively. In the winter sunlight, the bronze bird seemed to shimmer, frozen in the moment of taking flight. The base of melted chains was dark and heavy, but the birds rising from it were luminous with hope. People moved forward slowly, reading the notes on the locks. Children asked their parents what the words meant. Teenagers stood silently, absorbing the weight of what they were seeing. Adults wept openly. One of Maggie's former students, a woman named Rebecca, who was now a nurse herself, approached the wheelchair. "Mrs. Sullivan, you probably don't remember me. I was in your class in 1987. You taught me to love reading. You were always so kind to all of us." "Rebecca Miller," Maggie said immediately. "You had pigtails and you loved books about horses." Rebecca laughed through her tears. "That was me. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm so sorry for what you went through, but I'm so grateful you survived. You made such a difference in my life and I never got to tell you that." This scene repeated itself over and over as former students approached Maggie, sharing memories, expressing gratitude and sorrow. She'd thought she'd been forgotten, but they remembered. They all remembered the teacher who'd made learning fun, who'd believed in them, who'd seen potential in every child. Officer Torres appeared through the crowd. "Mrs. Sullivan, there's someone here who wants to meet you." She stepped aside and an elderly man came forward. He looked uncomfortable, nervous. "Maggie," he said quietly. "I'm Donald, Robert's brother. I don't know if you remember me." Maggie's face went pale. Donald was the brother-in-law who'd blamed her for Robert's death, who'd cut off contact. "I owe you an apology," Donald continued, his voice breaking. "A huge apology. I was angry when Robert died, and I blamed you because I couldn't face the truth, that my brother was sick and I'd failed to get him help. When Officer Torres contacted me and told me what had really happened, what Robert had done to you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Robert loved you. He talked about you often. He wasn't himself at the end. The illness took him from all of us." Donald wiped his eyes. "You're more generous than I deserve. Is there anything I can do to help you now?" "You can forgive yourself," Maggie said simply. "Like I'm learning to forgive myself. We all did the best we could with what we knew at the time." As the ceremony wound down, Dr. Foster, the trauma counselor, pulled David aside. "What you did for her, staying involved, advocating for her, it made all the difference. So many people would have just made the emergency call and walked away. You treated her like a person who mattered." "She does matter," David said. "Everyone does." "Not everyone acts on that belief," Dr. Foster replied. "You did." That evening, David had dinner with Maggie at her house. The visiting nurse had left for the day, but Patricia, the social worker, had helped stock Maggie's kitchen with food and taught her some simple recipes she could manage. "I've been thinking," Maggie said as they ate chicken soup and bread, the foundation that domestic violence organization mentioned. "I want to do it. I want to create a fund that helps people access medical care when they're too ashamed to seek it otherwise. People shouldn't have to suffer because they're afraid of judgment." "That's a wonderful idea," David said. "What would you call it?" Maggie smiled. "The Breaking Chains Foundation. We'll help people break free from whatever holds them captive. Abuse, addiction, mental illness. Everyone deserves help, and no one should be turned away because of shame." Over the next few months, Maggie worked with a lawyer to establish the foundation. The town held fundraisers. Donations came in from across the country, from people who'd heard her story and wanted to help. Within a year, the Breaking Chains Foundation had helped over 50 people access medical care, legal services, and counseling. Maggie became a public speaker, sharing her story at conferences and events. She was nervous at first, but she discovered that speaking the truth out loud was healing, and when people approached her afterward to share their own stories of suffering in silence, she knew she'd found her purpose. "I lost 23 years," she told David one afternoon as they walked slowly through the town park. She was using a cane now, no longer needing the wheelchair. "But I have years left, and I'm going to spend them helping others find freedom faster than I found mine." David had his own transformation. Seeing Maggie's courage inspired him to take risks in his own life. He and Jennifer didn't get back together, but they did become genuine friends, meeting for coffee once a month to catch up. He started a volunteer program at his clinic, offering free veterinary care to people experiencing homelessness or financial hardship. "Maggie taught me something important," he told Jennifer. "She taught me that helping someone isn't about being a hero. It's just about showing up and staying present when someone needs you. It's that simple and that profound. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Maggie had knocked on his clinic door, David and Maggie stood together at the sculpture in the town square. It had become a meeting place, a landmark where people gathered. Several other domestic violence survivors had added their own notes to the memorial, small papers tucked around the base, sharing their moments of choosing life. "Do you have regrets?" David asked. "About the years lost?" Maggie thought carefully before answering. "I regret not speaking up sooner. I regret letting shame silence me. But I don't regret surviving. Every one of those notes on those locks, those were real moments of beauty I witnessed. Even in captivity, even in pain, life offered me small gifts. I saw them. I appreciated them. They kept me alive." She touched one of the bronze birds. "And now I'm free. Truly free. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm not hiding. I'm living fully, maybe for the first time in my entire life." A young woman approached them hesitantly. She was maybe 25, thin, with shadows under her eyes. "Excuse me," she said to Maggie. "Are